Leif Erikson reached North America in the year 1000 AD. He stayed for one winter. Then he left, and the continent went back to silence for another 500 years. You are standing on that beach in Newfoundland in the year 1000 AD. The longship is pulled up on the shore. The men are building fires, and the forest in front of you is so thick and so vast that you cannot see where it ends. Nobody in Europe knows this continent exists, and in a few months they will go home, and it will be as if they were never here. If he had stayed, if the Norse had held that beach, built that colony, and made contact with the Americas 5 centuries before Columbus, history would look completely different, not just for Europe, but for every person already living on this continent. To understand why it matters, we first need to see what actually happened, and why one single morning on a beach ended the entire possibility. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly which decision unmade 5 centuries of possible contact, and what the world looks like when that decision goes the other way. Leif Erikson was not an explorer in the modern sense. He was a Greenlandic sailor in his early 30s who crossed the North Atlantic for timber, not for glory. Greenland had no trees, and a man without timber could not build a ship, a house, or a future. What he found was more than timber. He found salmon, rivers, wild grapes, meadows, and a coastline that seemed, to a man from the edge of the Arctic, almost impossibly generous. He also found people, and that detail, which the sagas record almost as an afterthought, would define everything that came next. To understand what kind of contact was possible, you need to understand what kind of people the Norse were in the year 1000. Not the Hollywood version, but the historical one. They were farmers and traders first, raiders second, navigators always. A culture that had already colonized Iceland and Greenland, not by conquest, but by settlement, by showing up and staying. They had something the Americas had never seen and desperately needed: iron. And the indigenous peoples of Vinland had something the Norse desperately needed: numbers, knowledge of the land, and the goodwill of every group between them and the interior of the continent. The archaeological evidence at Meadows in northern Newfoundland is unambiguous. 8 structures, a forge for smelting iron, the first in the Americas boat repair facilities, housing for up to 90 people, carbon dated to 1021 AD. This is not legend, it is physical fact. Early encounters with the indigenous people, the Norse called them skraelings, went both ways: cautious trading, furs exchanged for red cloth, genuine curiosity on both sides. There was a world being built here, slowly, between people who had no common language and every reason to be afraid of each other. Then Leif left after one winter, and his brother Thorvald came back to push deeper into the continent. Thorvald spent 2 winters exploring the coast. The sagas describe him as genuinely curious, sailing further south than Leif had gone, naming bays and headlands as if he intended to stay. On his 3rd summer, his crew found a group of indigenous men sleeping under their canoes on a beach. They attacked, they killed all but one man, and that one man escaped. He returned with a fleet of canoes. Thorvald was struck by an arrow through the armpit and died on the shore of Vinland, the first recorded European to be killed in the Americas. After that morning, the Norse tried once more a larger expedition of over 100 settlers, cattle, seeds, families. They lasted 3 years before the indigenous resistance became impossible to sustain against, and they sailed home. The structural problem was numbers. All of Norse Greenland had roughly 400 people total, against an indigenous population of thousands in Newfoundland alone and millions further south. The Norse were not outnumbered. They were irrelevant to the scale of what they had found. The Norse did not fail at Vinland because they lacked courage or ships. They failed because Thorvald destroyed the one resource that could have compensated for their small numbers: indigenous cooperation. What makes this so painful is how close it came to working. The sagas describe a period before the violence when trade was functioning, when both sides were curious, when a Norse child and an indigenous child could stand on the same beach and point at each other's boats without anyone reaching for a weapon. That window, brief, fragile, real, is what Thorvald's attack closed. Not just for the Norse, but for everyone. One attack, one morning. That is all it took to end 5 centuries of possible contact. But what if Thorvald had walked away? In our alternate history, Thorvald sees the men sleeping on the beach, and he does not give the order. Not because he is a better man, but because he has watched the trading work and understood what it is worth. He sends word back to Greenland. This place is worth holding, but we need more people, and we need to keep our weapons sheathed. More ships come, not an invasion, but a trickle. Families, craftsmen, anyone willing to commit to a coastline they have never seen. And within a generation, children are born at Vinland, who speak both Norse and the language of their indigenous neighbors. The trade holds iron tools moving inland through indigenous networks, furs and food and knowledge moving back. Neither side needs the other to disappear, and that mutual usefulness is the most stable foundation any relationship between strangers has ever had. The Norse bring iron, cattle, dairy, things that do not exist anywhere in the Americas. The indigenous peoples bring corn, which within 2 centuries of reaching Europe will change its agriculture so fundamentally that the Irish famine becomes impossible, and the population of Northern Europe doubles. This exchange, iron west, corn east, is not charity, and it is not conquest. It is the oldest kind of human transaction. 2 groups of people trading what they have for what they need. And it is the foundation on which everything that follows is built. By 1100 AD, Vinland is not an outpost, it is a destination. Small enough to still depend on indigenous goodwill, large enough to matter to both sides of the Atlantic. And word is spreading in both directions simultaneously. Iron enters the Americas in this alternate world, around 1050 AD, 440 years before Columbus. It moves inland through the same trade networks that already carry copper and obsidian and shell across thousands of miles, and it travels fast. By 1200 AD, iron is reaching the Mississippi Valley. Cahokia, already the largest city in pre-Columbian North America, now has metal tools that transform agriculture, construction, and warfare. A civilization that was already sophisticated becomes something history has no name for. By 1300 AD, Norse Vinland is not an outpost, it is a gateway. Permanent contact stretching from Newfoundland to the Gulf of Mexico, not through Norse conquest, but through the indigenous networks that were already there. Meanwhile, in Europe, corn has already arrived. The crop that in our timeline did not reach European fields until the 1500s is already growing in Scandinavia and the British Isles by 1250 AD. And its effect on European population and political stability is already diverging from everything we know. The Black Death still hits in 1347. Nothing in this alternate history prevents that but a Europe with a larger, better-fed population before the plague survives it, with fewer absolute casualties, and recovers faster. The 14th century in this world is still catastrophic, but not civilizationally defining in the way it was in ours. By 1400 AD, Norse Vinland is a string of coastal settlements from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia. Not cities, not empire, but permanent communities of perhaps 3,000 people, mixed Norse and indigenous ancestry, speaking a language that did not exist before they created it together. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois, form their great League of Peace earlier in this world, with iron-equipped warriors and a trade relationship with the Norse coast that gives them diplomatic leverage our timelines Haudenosaunee never had. When Columbus sails west in 1492, he is not discovering the New World. He is arriving late to a conversation that began 500 years before him, to a continent already in dialogue with Europe, already holding its own cards. Think about what that means concretely. The Spanish arrive in Mexico in 1519 to find the Aztec Empire in our timeline, a civilization that has never seen European armor, horses, or steel, and has no immunity to European disease. In this alternate world, they have had 500 years of filtered contact, 500 years of iron moving south through trade networks, 500 years of partial disease exposure. Cortés arrives with 600 men and finds not a civilization in shock at the existence of metal, but a civilization that has been working iron for 400 years. The conquest that in our timeline took 2 years does not happen the same way in this one. And the 85 million people of the Americas who died in our century of conquest, many of them do not die in this one. The legal fiction that justified the conquest of the Americas, the idea that this was empty land belonging to no one, collapses entirely when a Norse colony has been there for 5 centuries. You cannot claim what is already occupied, mapped, and traded. 4 centuries of partial exposure to European diseases before 1492 means indigenous populations have had time to develop partial immunity. The catastrophic 90% death toll of our timeline does not happen in this one, not because the diseases are kinder, but because the people have had time. But we have to be honest. Would the Norse have actually chosen trade over violence consistently for generations? Their history in Europe says no. The same culture that built Vinland also raided monasteries, took slaves from Ireland and Scotland, and extracted tribute at sword point across the British Isles. What we are really imagining is not a kinder Norse. It is a slower contact. And slower contact, even brutal contact, gives indigenous civilizations something Columbus never allowed them. Time to adapt, time to respond, time to survive on their own terms, rather than be erased in a single generation. The question is not which version of contact was kinder, it is which version gave more people more time to make more choices. And on that measure, 5 centuries of slow, imperfect trade beats 5 decades of rapid total conquest every single time. There is a version of this story where the Norse bring disease, and the disease spreads faster than the trade. And the catastrophe happens anyway, and we cannot rule that out. Partial immunity takes generations to develop, and the Norse are not careful about who they breathe on. History is not a moral test with a right answer. It is a system of forces and choices and accidents, and the best we can do is understand what the variables were. This alternate history does not promise a better world. It promises a different one, and different means more choices. And more choices means more possible paths to outcomes we would recognize as humane. L'Anse aux Meadows still exists. You can visit it today on the northern tip of Newfoundland, where 8 grass-covered mounds mark the place where the world almost split in 2. The forge is still there, the first iron ever smelted in the Americas, used for 1 winter and then abandoned. The coal left in the hearth, the grass growing back over everything for 1,000 years, until an archaeologist found it in 1960. We did not know for most of recorded history that Europeans had reached the Americas before Columbus. The evidence was there, under the grass, waiting, which means history is always fuller than we think it is, and the things we do not know are always larger than the things we do. Go back to the beginning, Leif Erikson. 1 winter, then gone. And 1 morning on a beach where a man named Thorvald had to make a choice, and a world that turned on that choice and does not know it. The shore they left behind filled up anyway with 5 centuries of a different history. A history that produced the world we know. And the world we know includes the conquest of the Americas and the death of tens of millions of people and the erasure of civilizations that took thousands of years to build. That did not have to happen, not in the sense that it was preventable by magic, but in the very real sense that it was the result of choices. choices made by specific people on specific mornings who could have chosen differently. History is not destiny. It is the accumulation of choices, and the most important choices are often the ones nobody remembers making. Next time on Empire's Echo, we go east, to the greatest city in the medieval world. In 1258, the Mongols came to Baghdad and burned the House of Wisdom to the ground. What if they had been stopped?